Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Martin Luther King Jr. Symposium at the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning here at the University of Michigan. I'm Jonathan Massey. I'm the Taubman College Dean, and I have the privilege of kicking off this great event. This is an annual event that is produced by graduate students in our Master of Urban and Regional Planning and our Master of Architecture Planning and some of our other graduate degrees. And it's a high point of our public programming and our internal conversations each year. This is a chance for the students to take the lead and curate a major conversation addressing some of the biggest topics that address the built environment, that shape the built environment. And the theme that they have chosen this year is "This is America," based on Martin Luther King's speech, "The Other America," addressing issues that are evergreen and also very timely. The simultaneity of inequality and excess in our society, the challenges people face around housing and employment, the possibilities for proactive action, and an emphasis on meaningful change through legislation and other channels. And this evening, they've pulled together a really compelling panel of three relatively early career colleagues who are working on this in different ways. One is an architect, one is an urban planner, and the other is an activist. I suspect we would say they're all activists in different ways, working in racial and economic justice. And I'm going to hand things off now to student moderator Fariha Khan from the Master of Architecture degree.
Hello. Thank you so much, Dean Massey. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tubman's 2022 MLK Symposium. I'm Fariha Khan. I'm a first-year Master of Architecture student here at Tubman, and I will be your moderator today. I'd like to start by thanking our panelists for joining us, our student organizers for putting this event together, and our supporting staff. This meeting is being recorded and closed captioning is available. We will be taking questions from our audience, so if you have a question for our panelists, please refer to the comment section on the right-hand side of your screen. Following our panel discussion, we will have a 15-minute break, then move into breakout rooms to provide an opportunity for students to meet and interact with each panelist. During today's discussion, we will cover topics such as mutual aid, policy, and MLK's Poor People's Campaign. For context, mutual aid, as defined by Vice.com, is a system in which communities take on the responsibility for caring for one another, rather than forcing individuals to fend for themselves. Mutual aid is also not charity. It creates a symbiotic relationship where all people offer material goods or assistance to one another. Mutual aid organizing is volunteer-run, transparent, and driven by the needs articulated by community members. Now, mutual aid, as it's often seen in the 21st century, is aid that is facilitated through social media, often through screenshots of GoFundMe pages, or direct payments on cash apps, where grassroots groups share stories or requests on Instagram, Facebook, or other social media platforms. Conversations surrounding mutual aid also often regard the presence or absence of policy. Policy is a series of guidelines to affect a desired or imagined outcome. Typically, policy refers to the informal, broad aims of government and public sector institutions that often invoke principles and precedent. Policy differs from law in that laws specifically prohibit or enable behaviors under the guidance of policy. While covering topics such as mutual aid and policy in today's discussion, we will also address design justice. Design justice is an approach to design that is led by marginalized communities and that aims explicitly to challenge rather than reproduce structural inequalities. It has emerged from a growing community of designers in various fields who work closely with social movements and community-based organizations around the world. To many of our viewers, this discussion may bring about a lot of new information which can cause a degree of discomfort. But I invite you to honor that discomfort in an effort to foster important conversations. After all, we cannot change what we do not confront. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, Britt Red, Kayla Gore, and Imani Day. Britt Red is the principal planner for land use strategy for the City of Indianapolis Department of Metropolitan Development. They have collaborated with neighbors and community advocates on regional and neighborhood plans, the design of public spaces, green corridor revitalization, and economic development strategies. Britt also manages the People's Planning Academy, a free training that educates neighbors about planning, zoning, and development with the goal of increasing representation in planning processes. Kayla Gore works to help organize and conduct direct outreach and advocacy for the rights of women, especially transgender women. Kayla's most recent work has been with the Tiny House Project, with the goal of developing tiny homes for Black and Brown trans women. With the assistance of Jasmine Wright and the DKGR architecture firm, they launched the pilot for the project in 2021. Imani Day is an award-winning licensed architect and adjunct professor living and working in Detroit. After 10 years of working for esteemed global architectural firms, she founded Revision Studios, which is a design and research office grounded in editing and improving spaces of varying scales, with social progress at the top priority. Imani also serves on the NOMA National Board and local Detroit AIA Board, continuing to champion equity within the profession. As a writer and editor, Imani works to amplify underrepresented voices and uncover social issues in the industry. She is proud to be the 13th African-American woman to become a licensed architect in the state of Michigan and 463rd in America. Hello all, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Doing great. How are you?
Great. Excited to be here.
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
All right, to begin our conversation, I'd like to give each of you a moment to reflect on your own work and how it intersects with MLK's description of the other America.
I guess I can start. When I think of that related to my work, I think that's it goes back to my experience and how I've experienced what brought me to planning. So I was brought to planning by noticing folks missing at tables when it comes to planning what communities would look like. I worked at a nonprofit organization and doing really important work. But through that experience, I was, working with developers, other planners, architects, and kept wondering who's responsible for making these plans, right? And then I found out, well, this field isn't very diverse, and the tables when it comes to planning these communities aren't very diverse at all. So part of my commitment isn't just to pull myself up at the table, but then also make sure that I'm bringing other people, informing other people, sharing the knowledge, and then making sure that I'm not the voice of the people, that I am using my skills as a planner to work alongside neighbors. So that's what I envision.
Well, I'll follow with that. The way I envision how the reflects the description of Martin Luther King's The Other America is because the trans community is also often viewed as not a part of America. We went through an administration that sought to basically eradicate us when it came to the human rights that we deserve. The Tiny House Project, it embodies all the things that Martin Luther King dreamed about having home ownership, because that's a part of the American dream. For trans people, especially Black and Brown trans people, that's very far out of reach. But with the Tiny House Project, we're breaking down a lot of those barriers that prevent us from becoming homeowners in America.
Yeah, I think, I guess in relation to the Other America or MLK's Other America, I think I also relate that to my experience, especially in this industry where I started at firms that really work on some of the wealthier projects, the bigger budgets. I think it's actually sometimes unlimited budgets or someone's third penthouse, or museums with unlimited budgets for their build outs for renovations and new builds. And so moving to Detroit and coming to Detroit and living and being here and understanding the realities of the neighborhoods here, and some of the neighborhoods who maybe downtown are economically flourishing in one way, there are neighborhoods in Detroit that are severely struggling. And I'm working now, I think, with my experience in working with other firms, both in New York and here, those larger corporate clients are the bigger projects where you are not designing within rampant vulnerability. There's like a very kind of like smaller gap with the experiential hierarchy of what we're designing to. And so now with revision, most and all of my work is definitely focused on revitalizing neighborhoods and actually getting into Detroit's public schools or Detroit's neighborhoods and actually creating the spaces that allow for home ownership, that fill in some of the gap-toothed blocks, and try to actually kind of heal in one way or another alongside communities, not for them. And so I think it's a really interesting kind of dichotomy here where the beginning of my experience was so different from what I'm currently doing now, but it took me a long time to really find the social purpose and be able to apply the skills that I had built to this. And so that's where I would start with the other America.
Yeah, and I think each of you nodded towards this sort of lack of acknowledgement that so many people and so many groups of people have within this industry. Mm-hmm. So I would love to know, within your experience, where is the other America made visible or invisible? And in which America do you see yourself operating? Has this changed over time?
I guess I could answer this. I maybe just kind of nodded to it. I think I started off in a different America where at some point there were projects where we were literally talking to some developers about corridors or actually separating socioeconomic status entry and circulation through a building. Actual racist practices that say, we are wealthy, we don't even want to see this group. We don't even want to pretend they live in the building, even though there's like this affordability requirement. We want to acknowledge it, we want to get around it, and we want to make sure that this is not deterring other wealthy people from being here. And like all of these other, there are some aspects of my earlier experience that were actually very much so kind of public and open, and cultural experiences grounded in good things and open-mindedness. But now thinking in a lot of ways, just how you pivot to the other side. And as an architect, so much of my early concerns were about whether I had the skills to provide to communities of color, Black and brown communities that may be more vulnerable, whether I could actually maybe build up how to do things, then transfer. And I think that's a big issue where we then start to erase or make invisible a part of your experience that can be applied very early on to communities that need it a little bit more. I think that's actually on the educational institutions too. And I don't want to get on my soapbox about that, but as a student, it's also how I kind of left school thinking I've got to learn on these wealthy projects of sorts, and then I can apply, and then I can switch, and then I can shift. And I think it's on universities to actually start to allow students to design to the communities that we're now talking about, this other America. Whereas in a lot of ways, I think design education and other architectural education, maybe urban design, deals with it a little bit more. They're focused on maybe more theory or like these kind of like Eurocentric examples of what we should be designing to. I think that's how we make these things invisible, is not teaching it. And so I'll stop there before I rant.
No, absolutely.
I'd like to jump right on behind you because you hit a lot of points that, like, the tiny house project is that example of a student being able to come in and work with an architectural design firm and work with a grassroots organization to design these homes with the community, with their input, with their insight, and their approval, of course. Yeah, it's like, this is that project. This is the example of everything that you just said.
For me, I think the events of 2020 kind of simultaneously made the invisible visible, and then also invisible. When I say that, I think after 2020, during 2020 and post 2020, almost every planner that I came across was reading The Color of Law, which is interesting because I think Black folks, whether you're in design fields or not in design fields, have talked about disinvestment, have talked about harmful policies among ourselves but no one was hearing us. We talked about like how our family was impacted by exploited practices. We talked about not being able to get a home, folks coming back from war, not being able to get the promise to them that was the GI Bill. So this conversation hasn't been new. Like it's not new. It's been ongoing. So me, it was kind of like I don't know. It's kind of like a form of like gaslighting. Like this, why is everybody having book clubs now about this? Like, folks in our fields that are, people of color have been having these conversations. So that's one thing that really struck me, is just how much people can be so vocal about the issues they're facing, pleading for government, designers, planners, nonprofit folks to acknowledge these historic harms. But it wasn't until 2020 that it became mainstream. So that's what the other America has looked to me.
Yeah. And Britt, you mentioned how much visibility has changed or shifted since 2020. And I think it's important that we acknowledge how much has changed since the start of the pandemic until now, and will probably continue to change. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we talk a lot about with topics like this is mutual aid. Have you seen the nature of mutual aid change since the pandemic? And if you have, how? And this question goes to all of you.
I mean, I will definitely say I've seen it change. I've noticed prior to 2020, there were a lot of initiatives that deemed to help people who are in marginalized communities that didn't really get a lot of attention. And during the pandemic, during the Black uprising, I think it's kind of like what Britt just said. People had this aha moment of, wow, this has been happening in America forever, but now we're like seeing it. We can't ignore it. It's in our face. It's all over the media. And people felt bad. People are connected to some of those people who feel the way they feel about marginalized communities. And I feel that people wanted to do something about it, but everybody doesn't have the place to be on the front lines or to build the houses or be the architects. Some people, they can only fund these mutual aid projects. They know that they have this thing that someone else needs, and they allow someone or something to actually render that aid to people. I didn't really get into mutual aid thinking it was mutual aid, and that might be surprising. But when I got into mutual aid, it was because I saw a need in my community, and I knew that I had all of these connections that I could leverage, and that's a resource. And that's a resource that I leveraged for people that I was connected to here in Memphis, Tennessee. And I think it started to spiral during a lot of the mutual aid funds that were coming out from nonprofits across the United States during the pandemic and during the Black uprising. That started within the trans community during mutual aid, and I started to see it branch off into the cisgender community. And it's been like that historically, that the most marginalized people are the leaders of the actual responses and the actual answers to our problems. And then it gets co-opted, and then it kind of gets diluted, and then that powerful collectiveness of community kind of dwindles away. And I think that's where we're headed. Like we're going to like that, back to that dry spot where people are back into their comfortable spaces, and there's not a lot of commotion around anything that's impeding on someone's human rights. We still have a lot of issues with reproductive rights, but people are starting to get back comfortable with the day-to-day of America.
Yeah. I completely agree with everything that Kayla said. The one word that stuck out to me that you used, Kayla, was collective. And I think over the past few years, what has really been illuminated is the value of collective care. I think our society has very much focused on individualism. Let me look out for me and my family, or not even my family, just let me look out for me. And I think we have become aware of how much we need each other. Like literally, I'm wearing a mask for you. I'm, that sort of thing. I think that's how it's changed for me on an individual level. Like we're looking out for one another, and I've seen so many people just like through their actions. I mean, and that's part of the conversation of acknowledging some of these historical harms. I think white folks weren't impacted by these things, so that wasn't even on their radar. Redlining, urban renewal, disinvestment wasn't on their radar because they weren't impacted by that. So I think that's one thing that really jumps out at me that has changed on the individual level. When it comes to policy and mutual aid, I think money has changed. I think there's been a lot of organizations, to Kayla's point, doing really great work, have been doing good work for decades, but now they're receiving funds, much needed funds to support important work.
Absolutely. And I think that ties into like the policy within like foundations, because those are the people who are really leading the charge when it comes to funding the organizations that normally don't get the funding. And I think when you're working with grassroots organizations, you're directly doing mutual aid when you're funding those agencies. And what I think about mutual aid and how it can affect America and how it can make us a better place is just what Britt said, that collectively together we're way more powerful, and we do need each other, and we do rely on each other, whether we realize it or not. Like even in our own neighborhood, you may not even know your neighbor across the street, but they serve a purpose being across the street from you, and we may never ever meet. But that's what mutual aid is. It's not all about like funds and fiduciary. It's really about community.
Yeah, I really appreciate these two comments. I do want to say this out loud that I feel very new to the term mutual aid. And again, it's not, I think what Kayla said is that when you come into it, you don't identify it as that. And so now learning more about it, I'm like, oh, okay, I do feel a little bit more connected to it. But I think one thing that I'm hearing from both of you is the speed at which mutual aid can work actually is just speed alone is helpful, because in my brain, policy is money, but it's also just slow. Like it's very, very, very slow. And it's always dependent on the priorities of whoever is in political power at that time, which is likely to be widely going to be white and male. And so when we have issues in the deeper aspects of our neighborhoods or the deeper areas of our neighborhoods that policy just can't see yet, or like it was invisible prior to 2020 and now it's taking too long for someone to actually get the help. That's when you see communities start to organize and come together in a faster way, because we just can't wait for policy all the time. And so I think the question on the screen is a little bit more about how they can influence each other and how they can maybe contribute to systemic issues, resolving systemic issues. And I think this is an issue of the luxury of being able to wait. So if there is a policy where it's like, all right, in 10 years, if we see this happen, like, cool. Right now, there's a lot of issues that we just can't afford to wait on. And so to me, I think mutual aid kicks in there, where when you can't rely on your local government, when you can't rely on your national government, what else can you do? And as Kayla said, like, power, collective power is more than political power to some degree, when we can actually get to the point of organizing and getting beyond the point of just beginning to address the issues. And so I'm really excited to hear more about this and talk more about this in this conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Imani, you actually perfectly segued me into my next question, which was going to be, does the existence of mutual aid necessarily imply a failure at the policy level?
I would say basically what Imani just said. I don't necessarily think that it's a failure, but I think that there's a sense of it's not urgent, or it's not emerging enough that we need to attend to it now. But the people who are actually directly affected by it are like, I can't wait till tomorrow. I could die. This needs to be taken care of today or in the immediate future. it needs some type of attention. And I think, like Imani put it,
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of failures in policy. Like, it's okay to say it happens all the time. I think, like Britt mentioned, like zoning laws alone, so they did not affect white people in the same way or affect different communities in the same way. That's a big like redlining. The issues that are actually just rooted in urban policy alone, there's like failure everywhere there, right? We're just getting to a point where we're actually starting to think about reversing and like responding to those failures. And so I think in a way, I was like, I don't want to be negative. Like, I don't want to call people failures. I don't want to call policy a failure. I think it is speed again. And then I think it's just priorities of how we actually respond to each kind of very damaging actual issue of policy in our past, and then what mutual aid then comes to meet it, so that we can move a little bit faster than what policy would really need. Because in my brain, it's like, if we even start, I actually thought about this issue when it came to the contaminated plumbing systems in the Detroit public school system. I said, okay, I'm not a plumber, I'm not in like the utility unions. How in the world can I be helpful here? Because as an architect, I don't necessarily always touch the water systems in a building. I don't touch the municipal water systems in really any way. I guess I could, but then the rabbit hole that was just figuring out where to start raising an issue, which obviously this is an issue like the city of Detroit, the school district is aware of. But the solution right now is to bag up, or the solution, I guess, in 2018 was to just kind of like, the funds weren't there, the voting wasn't there. There were so many layers of issues before you could even really start to say, all right, how are we going to actually resolve this? It's really a lot of layers to it. And so I guess the failure of it is just that there's so many different things that need to come together before you can actually even start to think about solutions. It's really just, it's mind-boggling to me. And actually, somewhere along the way, I then learned, I got into a different rabbit hole about building codes and unions and what it takes to actually just move on this. Once there is a solution, there are a lot more layers once there is a solution. And so really interesting kind of topic and rabbit hole to go down, but again, too slow, then mutual aid has to come in a different way, or, you know, communities have to come in a different way to bring clean water to the children of Detroit public schools, and or warm environments, non-toxic environments. And so it's an interesting thought of whether it's failure and or just kind of like delayed beyond belief and complicated beyond belief.
I think it's a little bit of both. We kind of experienced that here, building in older Black communities where the zoning has changed in the city completely. And it's by area. Like, there's areas in the city of Memphis where there's like gentrification happening, where the zoning is like universal. You can do anything you want with it as long as you're doing something nice. And that goes along with our Memphis 3.0 plan. However, in Glenview, where we're building, which is a Black community, you have to have a certain amount of square foot to actually build a house or a multifamily unit. And back in maybe the 50s or in the 20s, those pieces of land were zoned off in like 5,000 square feet cordons, which makes it impossible for anybody to really come in and redevelop the neighborhood in a proper way where it's affordable. Because you have to go through so many different like zoning and approval boards just to get to the point of, I'm going to build. Like, we had this idea to build these tiny homes. We never knew that we would have to go through so much just to start building, you know, a single house, just to do that and to provide affordable housing. And then there's like a process in which we have to notify people of what we're doing, who we're bringing into the community, who will be inhabiting these spaces, which put us in a situation where we're like, oh, should we tell them that we're going to be housing people of trans experience, who have also experienced homelessness, who are also people of color? Like, will the neighbors, will the churches in those particular areas say, no, we don't want this? And I think that I think that helps, but it also hurts the community as well, because on those calls, we heard other initiatives being turned down by the residents that were already there. And it's almost as like, that's the America that we're in. And when you see it rear its ugly face, you're like, oh my God, like these are actual human beings that actually feel like this, and they're not ashamed to say it, or they're not ashamed to do it. Yeah, and I'm going down a rabbit hole, so I'm going to stop it right there. See if Britt has something.
So I am going to say yes and no. I think that when I think about mutual aid, it's a little bit broader. So I think mutual aid is community care, is collective care. And I think that that's a really important part of our society. It's an important part. It's a critical element of our communities. We need mutual care. We need, collective care, mutual aid. I think that's just a part of humanity. Like, what is humanity without your neighbor? You know, like it's right. we need one another, and especially in those times when we can't fulfill our own needs 100%, or we're down, or that's when people step up. So I think that's mutual aid needs to be a part of our community. Like that's just part of humanity. However, I think a reliance on mutual aid definitely illuminates a failure of policy. I think that policy cannot replace mutual aid because there are so many. We talked about Amani. You mentioned politics. Like politics are slow. You know, there's so much red tape. There's power games and negotiating that doesn't necessitate the speed that you were mentioning. But yeah, I think it's yes and no. It's just a matter of unfortunately the society that we've crafted over time, policy is a thing. I mean, in an ideal world, if we could recreate this thing we call society, maybe we would need policy because we would just be taking such good care of each other.
Yes.
Ideal.
Yeah, that emphasis on community is so important. And I think in current times, we've seen social media have a huge influence in unification of the collective, and it's now often used as a tool in promoting mutual aid. So, how do you see social media impacting how mutual aid operates, specifically since the pandemic? And how has it impacted how policy operates, if it has?
I think accountability. So when I was in undergrad, I did undergrad in international studies. It was during the time of Arab Spring. So if y'all remember, I think this was, maybe 10 years ago, that was happening. And that was triggered by, in Middle East, North Africa, social media. People were recording this. It's literally the same unfolding. One person's death was shared across platforms, and it inspired people to like speak out, activists. Like it was a movement in an entire region of the world. And I think that's exactly it's really crazy, the parallels between Black Summer and Arab Spring. But I think that's the most important thing, is really accountability, illuminating things. I think there's been some like you get like sound bites of like cancel culture and all that sort of thing. And I think it's an opportunity. Social media allows an opportunity to call people in to do what they say they're going to do, or improve in ways that are much needed, and not just at the individual level, but institutions, making important change, and also just like helping one another, spreading the word. People have important platforms, and sharing the platforms that people have to uplift different issues.
Yeah, I guess I would say a similar note about accountability, but also the visibility and just access to the issues. Because I would say, Black lives were being taken for forever now, right? Like there's no, but social media kind of amplifying these issues at least gives people who were maybe not aware, like maybe just kind of not paying attention to it. Like there's really no way if you're on Instagram during the summer of 2022 that you don't know, unless you are in a really, really, really cushioned community, or like you really only follow, I don't know who you would even be following if you still did not have any idea. But I think in that way, I think the visibility and then just undeniability of some of these issues, which can go either way in terms of like the, I guess, not validity, the what's true and what's not, right? But beyond that point, I think some of this also implies some of mutual aid, and in my brain, you know, community activism and some of those things in my brain really stay very local for a really long time without social media. And with social media, you can really aggressively push beyond your local level and actually to other countries, other places where people get a little bit more connected to your cause. And so those social media, I think, has some strong ills to it. I think there are some really, really interesting and good parts of how you activate communities. And then even when I would, at some point, I was just talking about examples of racism in the built environment, just like everyday things you should probably pay attention to. And I saw people say, I didn't even know this happened in my city. Like it was just a really small bite of something maybe happening in Detroit or New York or wherever. And they would say, I didn't know this was happening in my city. And now I want to do something about what I've now learned is happening around me. I didn't even know. So it's like the knowledge spreading faster, the visibility, and then actually being able to connect to people in like Des Moines or like whoever can listen to you at any point and then engage with you. You're only kind of like a couple of clicks away. So I've really found that to be a very powerful aspect of activism. Still saying that beyond the point of social media, you have to activate and actually do something from not behind the computer all the time. But I think you at least connect the dots, and then hopefully people move beyond that.
Yeah, that knowledge piece is so important. I feel like the information has been out there. However, I think not to call out universities. However, a lot of good information, a good amount of data research stays in ivory towers. And I feel like social media is an opportunity to like make this knowledge, this information more digestible for people. Like you don't have to read, 200-page report about whatever to understand what the issues are, or to like, I think the accessibility piece is so important. So I saw Kayla kind of laugh a little bit. However, I don't know if we were thinking about the same thing, but you know how we get like the social media activists who just stay on social media,
Right?
Who aren't doing the work. Okay, yeah, we had a moment. Okay, so
I know some of those people, and I'm like, how are you employed? Like people, like, yeah, but I completely understand. There has to be an activation point. I agree with both of your observations of being a tool of visibility and accountability, because those social media activists, some of those people have been held accountable for being social media activists. And I won't say that there's like no need for people who are social media activists, because those are normally the people who spread the word about the injustices that the people who are actually activists are actually tending to. So they serve a purpose in some sense, but we still have to hold them accountable as well. But I definitely think that social media has made a lot of things way more visible. Prior to the Tiny House Project, I worked with a national organization, and I got the opportunity to travel all over the United States. And that gave me a bird's eye view before social media became the thing that gave people bird's eye views of what's happening in different localities. So I think that social media has, like you said, Imani, it's ills, but it also has a lot of positivity in it. Like sometimes you have to take a break. I recommend that because it can become overwhelming a lot. And it can also bring you a lot of joy. Like this past week, just, looking at my timeline, seeing so many people thriving and enjoying the beginning of the year, it brought a lot of joy to me. And like my kitchen had just burned down last week, like the kitchen behind me. So like, and I should be, you know, very sad. And I am sad every time I go in my kitchen, I see all this black smut. But seeing social media helped me through that time because I was seeing people having a great time and enjoying themselves. And then there's not been a lot of people who've been needing mutual aid in this time because our government has been stepping in sort of a way to make sure that people have access to mutual aid funds or to funds, not mutual aid, but being there when they're supposed to. I think that's when policy is moving fast and swiftly because there were so many lights shined on the injustices that people were facing. People were facing housing insecurity. People who had never faced it before. That's when it became an emerging problem, and we have to fix this right now because those normal people who are not concerned about affordable housing were thinking about, I might need some affordable housing. And that's when policy actually works, is when the masses are facing this thing. The same with the pandemic. The masses were faced with a health crisis, and our government reacted and responded in a way that it's never responded before.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Policy does often focus on the needs of the masses, but also what happens then is sometimes those that are a part of minority communities become invisible. What are ways that policy or official government organizations don't address specific needs that your work has targeted? I know you guys have, all three of you have done a lot of activism work in different communities.
The one thing that jumps out to me is challenges between when it comes to affordable housing in my state between municipal and state government. So I don't know if you folks are familiar with preemption, but in the state of Indiana, well, I'll start with Indianapolis. Indianapolis, along with cities across the country, has been dealing with a housing crisis. And one of the tools that a lot of cities use to address affordable housing is providing inclusionary zoning. So that means, requiring developer mandates. So 18% of a new housing development has to be preserved for low income, moderate income people. Because of a bill that was passed at our state level, our local government doesn't have that as an option. And then there's a whole bunch of other policies that, policy decisions at the state level that impact local government and kind of remove that. So I'm always kind of harping about that in my state because I think there's people that I work with on a day-to-day basis that are doing really good work, but just don't have options because of legislation at the state level. Also, primaries are coming up. So just a reminder for folks watching.
The people that need to hear their warning are not on this, probably not watching this. But for us, so there was a lot of money that were funneled to states and counties from the American Rescue Act, and it was budget time last year in the state of Tennessee. We did a lot of advocacy work around working with other organizations here in Memphis that provide some sort of mutual aid or any type of resources to the vast majority of the community of Memphis. With something we call the people's budget. And it's a budget that kind of like pushes the actual county budget to the side and says, this is what the city of Memphis needs. And we approached the city council with the budget. And of course, they were like, no, we're going to fund what we have with our community services. But there were caveats, that we could apply through agencies that were already in existence for any type of resource that we needed. However, with the trans community, it's always been like an uphill battle. It's always been barriers when trying to access services through those organizations. For the pandemic specifically, there were makeshift shelters set up in hotels here in Memphis for people to quarantine in, and for people who didn't have housing when they put safer at home orders in place. A lot of advocates of houselessness, were like, everybody can't be safer at home because they don't have home. So that pushed, our elected officials to say, we're going to set aside these funds to convert these hotels into temporary living spaces for families and children. But the language that they used excluded the LGBT community, more specifically trans people and trans kids. And even language that we're facing excluded us, and we're like, okay, well, I can't go over there and get that. Even the people who were bold enough to go steal and say, I'm homeless, I need somewhere to stay, or I have contracted COVID and I have to quarantine, I don't have anywhere to quarantine. Those people were discriminated against because of the language from the higher ups, not directly and specifically including people from marginalized communities like the LGBT community.
I think that I don't want to say that the policy or official government organizations don't address something, but I think they perhaps incorrectly address something, and or again are just going to be very slow to the punch. But I think in my work in particular, I think the two ways that things show up where things aren't being addressed is really kind of by zoning and environmental racism, in the sense that we now know that historically redlined areas of different cities and the divesting in those specific areas then results in fewer trees, fewer green spaces, no softscape, and access to resources. And so I'm day to day, I'm still kind of advocating for just like a tree sometimes, or like a small area that's just not hardscaped and actually physically warmer, because you just don't have the green and the actual just environmental resources to make the areas of the city either physically warmer or even just attractive in any way, so that people of all ages actually have some resources in their neighborhood. And I'd say that is both an argument at an urban level and at an actual just project to project level. Like how can we make sure that the ills of environmental racism, both by sometimes there are zoning designations that say industrial toxic projects can be right next to people's houses in their backyards. The neighborhood is screaming. We have all of these other health issues because of increased truck traffic, whatever's coming from your industrial site. How can we make sure that you guys aren't as close to us as you currently are? And they're not saying we hate all economic development in the city. It could be even for a good reason that something is maybe going next to your home. But to say out loud, we have the statistics and the data that says that you are giving us cancer, or you are giving us an actual disease here. And we have to sit and kind of argue on a city call about whether that building's still going to go there. It's very, very, it's hard to say that that's not intentional to some degree. Like the zoning doesn't change based on someone saying something like that. So it's not that it's not addressed, it's actually just poorly considered. And then again, in order to change zoning or to apply for any sort of variances, conditional uses, that takes time and money that some clients and or government organizations often have made the decision before there's any change to be made. But I also think that there's a lot there that slows you down from actually being able to protect the citizens of a neighborhood. And I think one big other thing, which I'll try to be very quick about, but highways are, again, they are addressed, but historically, as much as they have damaged communities of color and communities across America and erased Black communities across our nation, you might see the New York Times is like starting to cover these issues and say like, our cities are starting to reckon with whatever highway did to this beautiful, thriving Black community, or whatever type of community, whether it was thriving doesn't even really matter. Like, what are we going to do about it? These are things, again, that still, when a highway kind of runs through a community, which like it almost always, like especially in Detroit, it has to have run through a community. In other American cities, it has to have run through a tighter knit community. You siphon resources. You actually put someone on the wrong side or on a tough side of the highway that actually doesn't allow them to have access to the same resources and doesn't actually keep the community together. And so in my work, I see that again at like neighborhood revitalization efforts. It's like, okay, we, with the current budget and the thought, like we don't want to be proposing unrealistic things. How are we going to bridge across this huge highway? How are we going to actually try to reverse and connect these communities together without number one? And then how are we going to do it both at the neighborhood level, at the actual project, like architectural level, and in terms of bridging an actual highway or putting programming across a highway or erasing that highway and rerouting? All of those ideas kind of come into play. And again, I still think it's not an issue of whether it's addressed. I think it's whether it's prioritized and whether there's a budget and the priorities of the actual political group are focused on it, because a lot of times they just really aren't on these two things in particular, because these are hard issues. These are issues that affect the economic development and potential of a city if you start to attack them. And so, again, addressed, just not the way that I would address.
Yeah, and I have a comment about what you're saying. So like, Imani, you went through a list of issues, right? And that made me think of one of the issues I see that's lacking in policy is viewing things from a systemic perspective. So someone once shared me the analogy of like, if you're at a pond and you see a fish die, you're like, oh, what was wrong with the fish? Another fish dies, like, man, these fish. But if you see dozens of fish that are dead, you start thinking about the water, right? So in cities, if we start noticing disparities in access to public parks, racial disparities in policing, disparities in access to food, disparities in home ownership, disparities in proximity to hazardous waste. This is a systemic issue. So I see there's a major missed opportunity to see like the broader implications there. So I mean, we're kind of, preaching to the choir when it comes to like how these things emerge, right? There's a history of planning, intentionally harming people or intentionally excluding people from the conversation, which still resulted in harm that we're not addressing. We're addressing these disparities, like the symptom, but not the cause, right? So
yeah. I think just thinking about like contamination of Black communities, whereas like here in Memphis, a lot of our Black communities had a lot of factories and plants that were in them because the land there is cheap. And it's still the same sense of factories being in the Black communities. But those communities that we're building in, that we're trying to acquire land in, we're having to have soil tests done on them. And one particular area in South Memphis, we did a soil test and it came back that the land was contaminated. It was too contaminated to even build on. And I'm like, and going through that process and just talking to experts, like, well, depending on the level of contamination, you can still build. Like the level, like if it's contaminated, it's contaminated. If it's going to cause people, like ailments in their like shorter lifespans, or the quality of their health is going to be, affected by it, I don't think that people should be inhabiting that area. And their house is there. They're literally houses right across the street. So I'm like, if it's contaminated here, it's surely contaminated across the street. And there are environmental justice organizations that are working on those particular issues in South Memphis. But like you said, it's speaking to the choir. Like no one really cares because that land shouldn't be able to even be like sold. If, in my opinion, it should not be sold ever again. It should be the property and the responsibility of the owners to either decontaminate it or figure out a use for it that doesn't, cause harm to humans or non-humans.
Yeah, I mean, and what you just called out, like the level of cleanup, there's disparities in that.
Yes.
There was a national study that was released years ago that investigated like Superfund site cleanup, fines for contamination, and they were significantly, like the fines were significantly lower in communities of color.
Mm.
And the Superfund, like the cleanup times were a lot longer in communities of color. So, I mean, here we are again, the other America.
The other America that they do not want to talk about. It's unhuman. It's like inhuman. For anyone, if I had some contaminated land, I would like put like bags over it or something. I wouldn't try and sell it. And these are people who specifically reached out to us and were like, "Hey, we got all this land. Do you want to buy it?" And they know what we're doing with our project, and they're like, "That's kind of is that ethical?"
How desperate are you?
Clearly, they thought we were super desperate.
Yeah, no.
It was a nice size amount of land with a very nice price tag. But, of course, with our architects, they did their due diligence to let us know, like, hold off on that.
Yeah.
So thanks for architects.
It's so interesting that each of you have so many of these examples from your experiences. Would you say that your work has changed or shifted your view on your city and the built environment?
Absolutely. In short, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's changed in a lot of ways. So I think a lot of my work and my scholarship has to do with like history of Indianapolis when it comes to like development, environmental justice, that sort of thing. So that has changed my perspective. Like, I think that kind of, in some ways, discouraged me because these issues have been happening for so long. We have papers, books written about things from like the 80s when it comes to inequities in Indianapolis. However, I've also been encouraged by seeing like the work that people are doing. I mean, this talk is about mutual aid. There have been people that are coming together that are like pushing for equitable built environments, are pushing for these issues to be addressed, and not just pushing for them, not just advocating, but doing the grassroots work to get it done. So yeah, I'm both encouraged, but then kind of, it's heavy because it's been happening for so long, these inequities.
For me, I would say it's done a lot of different shifting for me. I really respect women, especially women of color, who are doing this type of work, whether it's like in the architectural design realm or in the development realm, the housing development. Because I learned today that when I say development, people go automatically to like fundraising. And I'm like, no, I'm developing houses. I did that the other day. But I really take my hat off to women in this environment because like it is, for a lack of words, atrocious sometimes because it's a male-dominated space, and all of the things of the Me Too movement like are just like, it's just rampant. When working in development, especially in the South, especially being a Black trans woman, and knowing that everybody that I'm working with on this project is a masculine person, almost a masculine person. And we've had a lot of issues and a lot of concerns when it comes to just them working with us or working for our community because of their own personal bias, because of the way society views trans people, and that, you're guilty by association type of deal. Memphis is a small town. So, word gets around when you're working with certain people. And we have very small pool of people who are willing enough to actually work with us. But it has shown me that our city has some people in position to actually make a better place for Memphis 20 and 30 years down the line. Prior to doing this, I heard about the Memphis 3.0 plan, but I never delve as deep as I've been into it and learned all the aspects of it and what it means for me, what it means for people 30 years from now, I think that has really shifted my view of my city, because I just wasn't, I never even fathomed like what the process would be like, taking a house from slab to finish, of giving someone keys to their forever home, things like that. And then also working with our city, county, and planning boards, and always feeling like there was going to be like a hiccup, or there was going to be a barrier, or someone was going to have a personal bias against me as an individual, or me as a collective group of people, that will prevent us from moving to the next step. But being really surprised that people were super helpful, like with our city approval and variance board, they were like super duper helpful, because that process nearly like took me out. Like I had all of the potential to do all the work, but then when they were like, you have to notify people within a 5-mile radius, and you have to do this and you have to do that, it was very overwhelming. But knowing that the end goal was what we were planning to do, and that was to give people homes, made it all worth it. But as Imani said, like everybody doesn't have that, to be able to go through all of that process. They don't have that. Like some people just can't do it, and that alone can really kill someone. That can really put someone in a position where they're very vulnerable, because they're having to rely on others, because the processes are so complex.
Yeah, I mean, I second both of those. I feel like I've had very similar experiences. To me, I think my work has changed or shifted in that before I couldn't really understand, and I think a lot of people still don't understand, and I get this question a lot. I couldn't understand how the built environment, meaning like walls, doors, sidewalks, like whatever we're doing as architects, had anything to do with like how we're maybe as architects, and how architecture is complicit in perpetuating systemic racism. I was like, all right, whatever. Like, I don't know exactly what this wall has to do with anything, or like we're kind of separate. And I wasn't a naysayer. I was just kind of like confused about it. And now I think the work that I do, and over time I've learned how we actually are complicit. And it was fun for a while for me to be like, these are the examples of how we're, a part of this broken system, or how we're perpetuating these systemic issues. And just doing the research, I think, is one thing, and being knowledgeable about it is one thing. But then activating, again, putting my phone down, getting out from behind my computer, and then saying, on these projects, now I know how to actually apply and start to reverse some of these issues for a longer term, just longer term help. It's not always a solution. It's not always the solution. And in fact, it never is the solution. Architecture, I think, alone is actually very far from the entire solution. But I think through that, I've also learned that, for instance, when I was like, how am I going to fix this water problem? Or like, how am I going to attempt or get started trying to address the water problem with Detroit Public Schools? I swiftly learned that like there's nothing I can do without understanding how policy works, and then activating in a world of policy, which in most ways, my project work now just means I'm adjacent to political groups that are hiring me to do very specific things. So in this case, I'll say, I actually have a little bit more belief in the built environment, both, like Britt said, kind of encouraged and maybe a little discouraged at the same time, because incremental change, I think, is so painful sometimes. It's so slow. But the hope is that, by each project, you actually start to reverse and make tangible change in your communities. But again, understanding that I don't know that we can move forward in the architectural community without understanding how policy deeply affects us, not only by zoning, but by our actual building codes, by law, by our oath as architects. There's so many aspects of this where you cannot really detach the two. And I think people who come to me and say, well, like, okay, what does the water systems have to do with like this one project that I'm on right now? Or, what is zoning from the 60s do with me right now? And I think it's about knowledge and awareness, and equipping yourself with the tools to actually address these things in projects where you may not be able to see them today. So I think it's really, really changed. I used to kind of get bored on projects that were taking too long. And now there's like not a chance that I'm going to be bored. I know that's one thing. And I think it's very exciting to continue to uncover these like real world issues of how we start to combat these things as activists and policymakers and architects. So if anything, I think it's just separating those two ideas of policy and design are actually very detrimental to the entire design community. And we have to find ways, again, at the teaching level, to make sure that this is not something that I find out when I'm 30. It's like I could have learned when I was 17 or 18. I would have been way more active. I would have been stronger by now because I wouldn't be like still in some training wheels in some areas just trying to understand how these political systems work. And so I think it's been really interesting to see my focus on which clients I will accept now, because there has to be a broader social purpose for why I'm about to do this work with you, as opposed to you just need an architect. And as Kayla was saying, I think in a lot of communities, especially as a Black woman right now, to be the resource that helps you feel less overwhelmed by projects that are massive and massively impactful for your communities. If I know anything technically, if I can operate in the world sector and building departments and zoning and blah blah blah, then that means the world to me. It's a whole difference between whether I, as an architect, maybe a real change in the world, where I'm just kind of practicing at like the base level of what we're supposed to do. And so I think it makes a difference in my energy levels and what I can bring to the table and just who I am as a person. Like, am I able to actually use these skills for good? And am I actually able to join these communities in their activism efforts, not as like an authoritative, like, I know what you need, but like, I'm very differently aware of and differently behaving so that we can move forward in a really powerful and progressive way, as opposed to what maybe historically the architecture profession has done egotistically and demographically. And so anyway, that's what I would say for how my work has changed.
Yeah, I wanted to add one more thing about my the way my work has changed. I think I'm a more hopeful of the changing power balances. So through my work with People's Planning Academy, we've increased the knowledge base of our residents in Indianapolis. So in design fields, in community development, there's the power is isolated, and a lot of that has to do with the fields being dominated by white men. However, it's also it's not just professionals. It's like people who are equipped with the understandings of like planning and zoning. Those are neighbors. Those aren't professionals. So that the knowledge, which is a form of power, is still isolated. So you don't have like low-income folks, renters, people of color, like coming to these meetings, engaging in these processes because one, they may not have the time to, they may not have the understanding. So with People's Planning Academy, like we've equipped folks who haven't been historically represented in these processes with the knowledge so they can participate and provide them with resources to participate. And I've seen like really positive things come from that. For example, we have one of the graduates was asked to serve on the Board of Zoning Appeals. I mean, and she has like a number of, you know, important perspectives. So being like an immigrant, a person of color, this was someone that may not have been engaged, you know, if it weren't for that. And the fact that the city of Indianapolis is willing to invest time and resources into this training so residents can be equipped. Did you know knowledge is powerful?
Yes.
People with this knowledge can, you know, speak out about what they want to happen or don't want to happen in that community. So knowledge is powerful and it can also be dangerous. However, we know that in order for us to have thriving communities, we have to have like more democratic processes. And like to make processes democratic, it's like equipping folks with this knowledge. It shouldn't be isolated. Like only certain people understand like how a hearing works, or like how a rezoning, or like what's happening in their community. So hopeful.
All right. Yes, thank you all for that. That was very insightful. We will now transition into taking questions from our audience. So for anyone watching, if you have a question that you would like to ask our panelists, please continue to submit them in the comment section. And as we dive into our audience questions, I'd like to introduce my co-moderator, Jasmine Wright.
Here we go. Hello. I want to thank you all for being here today. Again, my name is Jasmine, and I'm a Master's of Architecture student in my thesis year here at Taubman College. As one of the student organizers for this event, I had the pleasure of moving us to the direct audience question and answer. So to start us off, I wanted to take a brief moment to bring up King's Poor People's Campaign and concerning the overarching theme of the Other America and coalition building. In his final efforts, King sought uniting food, justice, housing, gender, race, and the conditions that made poverty possible. He presented a campaign that would redistribute wealth and the current political structures. King's campaign maps nicely to the panelists and their work they're currently engaged in. So as we reflect on contemporary parallels, such as the Black uprisings of 2020 and union movements that are both challenging the growth of wealth disparities, has it been a struggle to challenge those power relations in your respective fields, communities, and places where you're building coalition? And if so, how have you found yourselves bumping up against these powers?
Kayla, you're on mute.
For me, it's a both and. I'm never really like a negative Nancy unless it's about me. I'm very hard on myself. But I feel that coming into the housing development world, I was kind of like, my first home I bought 4 years ago was through a CDC. Which is the Community Development Corporation. And that same CDC is the person who helped us find our builder. The same CDC is also a person who has helped me with navigating through emerging developers course that spearheads, kind of similar to the program that you all have, Britt, where it's empowering people who have the passion to do the work, but it's also skilling them up to be able to efficiently do the work. The struggles come in where race becomes a thing. Being here in Memphis, with a city that's predominantly Black, but when you come into the development world, it's very white. It's very white. It's very male dominated. And those power struggles have been very hard because I think Imani alluded to it before about you coming out of college and having to work with, big companies working on huge budget projects, whereas we're a small grassroots organization without a huge budget. People don't know about us for having a lot of money. They just know about us for doing our work. That's where our struggles have come into play, is actually finding like reputable people who can actually do this work, who can erect these buildings for us with compassion, not just skill. Those are where we're having struggles when it relates to that.
You go ahead. I was just gonna say, so I live in a fairly conservative state, and I would say recently I've noticed a shift within the past few years, specifically since 2020, when it comes to power relations. There's more. I've noticed folks in power are more receptive of addressing issues that perhaps wouldn't be as receptive if it weren't for uprising of 2020. So that's what really jumps out to me. As Kayla said, like the racial issues, we're having conversations about race and about it in different aspects, whether it's addressing zoning inequities, addressing housing disparities, addressing knowledge. So I think there will be difficulties regardless, but I think I've definitely noticed a shift in it becoming easier. Just I think I said earlier how folks have been doing racial justice work forever, but then within the past few years, there's more support, more resources behind that. So I think,
thanks to social media.
yeah.
Holding people accountable, making sure that minorities have a huge percentage of any type of contracts that are coming from the county, the state, or the federal government. I think that plays a huge role in a lot of things. And I think us being able to make it through all of these approval processes also heavily relies on the fact that we are Black, that we're building these homes for Black and brown people. No one wants to be seen as the person who's saying no. We're going to stop this, or there's a problem with this. And we have had problems. We have had issues in the past, with code enforcement and things like that. But nothing specific to us, just more specific to the people that we've commissioned to do it.
Yeah, I think one thing I really love about this is that this is not, I don't have an issue with the I Have a Dream speech. I want to say that very clearly, but I think that the focus on the Other America and or the Poor People's Campaign, I think is that I understand it to be, or, the reading and understanding of this part of MLK does lean more radical. It actually is less about kind of Black and white people coming together. It's actually no, we're actually talking about the details of poverty, who's responsible, the war in Vietnam. We're going to talk about some very uncomfortable things. And we need to be aware and knowledgeable about these things. And no one likes it when you talk about the uncomfortable stuff. No one wants to be called racist. No one wants to be the person that says, no, we don't have the budget to save, to engage with these projects. They just don't work toward the bottom line. Nobody wants to actually be the person to say, we're focused on money, or we're not focused on actually, being an advocate in this space unless it benefits us by marketing and or money. And so when you are the one being hey, you are racist, this is racist, this is injustice at play, and your actual response of, questioning the validity of what is racist in the environment versus what is not. Beginning to exclude people, to ignore these issues, make them more invisible because now you're uncomfortable, now so you don't have an excuse as to why you're not acting. I think that has come up a lot in my experience here, where you're advocating to help a group, or you're actually trying to rally people to either donate time or donate energy, whatever it is, to these projects. I think because the profession of architecture has been so historically white and male, it makes them uncomfortable when they're not the ones actually participating, or they're choosing now not to participate, or choosing to stay ignorant about certain things, or choosing to question whether I'm right about certain aspects of where we are not operating at our max potential in terms of responding to communities in need. That's where I get into probably the most debate and the most bumping up against the powers. But still, it's not cool to be visibly against these things. And so it's kind of a little bit more, I'd say it's less in a forum like this where someone's calling me racist, the fact that I'm not active in these arenas, or the fact that I live in Vermont and I just don't see Black people or anything, this isn't my fault. I need to I don't want to feel bad about this. I don't want to feel bad about this. I think that's where I see it the most, where where the call to action for the industry itself or the actual field of architecture, the response is with hesitant, like, I don't want to do this hard stuff and I need to get paid, so I'm not going to move forward until there's a dollar amount or until people start to see the worth in this. It's like there's a lot of work before that point, before people can actually afford to do some of this work, or before we can get full funding for everything. And again, mutual aid and other ways, we just like cannot afford to wait all the time. We can't afford to just like hope that these groups come up with millions of dollars to do these impactful projects in the neighborhoods here. And so I think that's where, I think when we start talking about money and moral values of each individual versus the industry, that's where I'm getting a little bit more resistance.
Perfect. So we're going to take two of our commenters. So we're going to look at Haley. Haley said that they're curious about your thoughts on inadequate housing and what are the ways or programs you have seen working to improve housing conditions. And I think we might also show JJ, which is also similar line. What are some of the best practices you like for maximizing municipal livability and affordable housing? Any thoughts on housing density we should seek and the value of mixed use developments? So one's on, the previous one was on inadequate housing and your thoughts on that.
You're muted again, Kayla.
Sorry. Look, I'm used to just like having it on, and then when I cut it off, yeah, sorry about that. I was just gonna say, I think housing inadequacy is universal, like it's all over. We're all facing a housing deficit in the United States. And I think that here in Memphis, the programs that are helping are community development corporations with housing. Like I said, I bought my first home through a first-time home buyers program that was run through a nonprofit that was led by a Black woman that they didn't base their like who they were going to give a house to off of a credit score or your credit history or your rental history. They based it off of who came into the office, and what you present to them in person and your living circumstances. Like, had you been on your job, a certain amount of time, it was a very low barrier with a 1% interest rate. And I think that pouring into programs like that we know that are actually on the ground, working with people who are actually on the ground, I think that would help a lot when it comes to improving housing conditions. A lot of those CDCs, especially like our CDC, we're taking older homes and we're renovating them as well, which I think spirals something within communities. Like when I purchased this house 4 years ago, like it didn't look beautiful. It was just what I needed. It had bedrooms, it had bathrooms, it had walls. But over the years, we've been able to make improvements, and those improvements that we've made on this house have also like spiraled improvements on other people who are homeowners in the neighborhood. So I think that, and that comes from working with a nonprofit who does housing development on a much larger scale than we do. That's what it's going to take to improve housing conditions, is that it's going to have to be done locally. It can't come from an outside investor to come in and we expect them to do right by our community, because they're not. They're going to charge us. Yes, we'll have nice houses, but will they be affordable houses? That's the question when we're dealing with out-of-town investors. And the second question, I can't see it, so I'm just going to let somebody else go.
What really jumped out at me was having a toolbox of options when it comes to addressing housing issues. So, like, for instance, I think, Kayla, you mentioned maybe lot size. There are elements within like planning and zoning that limit housing options, mm-hmm. that they're not considered discriminatory. So, like, for instance, we updated our land use plan in Indianapolis to no longer recommend single family, like to have single parcel recommendations. So that allowed more diverse housing options. So by saying, instead of saying this parcel we recommend for single family, this parcel we recommend for this type of dense multifamily, we say, okay, no, this is the type of neighborhood this is. So this could be a variety of things. So I think that's one way that you can address that. Also, from a more development standards perspective, you can really address like the tools of zoning. So lot size, your look at lot size, setbacks, because those have historically been used as tools to keep Black people, low income people out, because you have to have a certain income to be able to build on this huge lot size or have these huge setbacks. So I think planning and zoning tools, but then also thinking about affordability. So we have sometimes we have affordability periods that may last 30 years for projects or 15 years for projects. Why not permanent affordability? And there's a lot of push nationally to advocate for permanent affordability when it comes to projects. Also, the intersection of quality and affordability. So we have a city architect on staff. So when we have housing projects or housing developments come across our desk, we don't want like the cheapest materials that you can find because this is going to be affordable housing. You gotta, beggars can't be choosers kind of type of mentality. No, like everybody deserves quality housing.
Yes.
And to find that intersection of affordable or not to find, but that should be the goal, to have affordable and quality housing. So those are just some things. It has to be a really comprehensive look at things, from zoning to architecture to funding. Yeah.
I guess I would say very similar things. Like, I guess in my experience, in terms of before you get to the density that you're looking for, or whether the mixed use projects in the neighborhood are helpful, you have to do quite a bit of due diligence just to understand what affordable means to that neighborhood. And again, like that changes. A lot of times that is driven by market analysis, which is also rough because the market does not always align with the actual existing community that is trying to either increase ownership and some sort of stake in the neighborhood, so that as things change, they don't get displaced. Or you have to also understand that this is where the knowledge of the knowledge of historical practices that exclude people from home ownership in a neighborhood. This is when you're working with clients to say, hey, instead of us just kind of like doing this feasibility study, market analysis, throwing what we consider affordable housing, which will likely be some really kind of rough version of construction, I think we have to start thinking about people first, like who they actually, like the variety of people is one thing, which actually starts to dictate the variety of types of housing, then starts to dictate who and how you densify that neighborhood, whether that's necessary, whether we can put 12 units in one place above a mixed use, like above a commercial space. There's a lot that goes into these questions, but the point is that we can't answer these questions unless I sit with a community, ask them enough questions, do my actual community engagement work, which community engagement, I think, seems very finite, but actually on a lot of projects I'm on right now, especially the neighborhood I'm working with out in Detroit, this is like, we're building tools so that community engagement is infinite. So you start to understand who's in the neighborhood, then start to accommodate the actual needs of the neighborhood. We do need to do some degree of market analysis so that we can actually start putting pricing on whatever the houses are. The client themselves, as like a CDC or community development corporation, their goal is to actually be giving away houses so that Black people in Detroit can actually own these homes, come into the neighborhood, keep control and ownership of their space. And so to me, I think it's an interesting question because I think a lot of times we want solutions first. And I would caution against it because listening is your best bet here. Then we get to the point of like, which materials are we going to use for this affordable housing? The real question is, who is this affordable to actually? And did they agree that this is what the case is? Like, there's a lot of questions where you're just like, if JJ or whoever the other question was, like, if I sit and talk to you about what you consider affordable versus what I might see in some of the neighborhoods of Detroit, it's going to be wildly different. The density that they're seeking in neighborhoods, though the market may say densify, keep construction costs low, the neighbors are going to say, right back to where I was before, don't increase truck traffic or don't increase, vehicular traffic here. We actually need less affordable housing. Maybe we need walkability. We need trees on the street. We need to, in the neighborhood I'm in right now, the trees are contaminated, like they are sick trees. And so the priorities of the neighborhood are actually very different. They're not saying no to affordable housing. They're actually saying before we get to that point, the existing housing stock needs a whole lot of help. It's actually just rehabbing some of these homes. And then we get to the point, there's like so many steps before and so much learning and listening to do before you get to the question of density. But I guess to answer the question, it's more so about when you get to that point, I think the market really drives that, which is unfortunate. The other question, I had a really, really lovely time with some developers here who actually have their own rent ownership models, or communities that are starting to allow home ownership of affordable, whatever we're talking, like whatever types of housing, whatever kind of mix of development in the neighborhood. When you put at least ownership at the forefront, and actually starting to understand that renters and like the swaying of the market actually depends on renters more so than the owners, and then the value of any new improvements in the neighborhood needs to directly benefit the existing, like the residents who have been there for however long, 1 year or 40 years. So I think my emphasis would be on home ownership and whatever models get you to the point where people are able to both afford and actually own their space, and then continue to improve their communities beyond that point.
During my housing development class, that was like our first month of conversations was community engagement, and making sure that before we go into a neighborhood, before we buy land in a neighborhood, that we were engaging the community so that they're not, taken aback by this development that's happening, or when there are notifications that have to go out, they're not like, oh, this is the first I've heard of this, and they're not familiar enough to say, yeah, it's okay for it to be here. We in Memphis is an activist city, and we have a lot of community development corporations in all different areas of our city. And just recently, there was an investment company that wanted to come in and renovate a hotel into luxury affordable houses. And the CDC was like, no, you're not going to come over here and do that. That's going to bring a bad element. But I think the CDC should protect communities and protect the people that are there. But in that particular instance, I don't think that they were thinking about the actual people who could afford those homes that were going to be converted from hotels into houses. And they were only thinking about the element that will bring to their neighborhood, and not really thinking about the people. And when I was able to put up a fight about it, it was a sealed deal. Like the investors had pulled out and said, we're not going to do this thing. And that has happened a lot here in Memphis when it comes to like marginalized communities being able to feel like they're getting a step ahead. It has happened with shelters that have been, set to be put in different neighborhoods because they have older historic homes with bigger rooms and multitudes of space in one solid area. And they're also close to a lot of amenities as far as like social services resources. But the people who can afford those neighborhoods are like, we don't want those people in our neighborhoods. So in a sense, the thinking is that community development corporations are to protect the neighborhoods and the inhabitants, but not always, kind of like Britt said, do those people who are actually from the community get to be a part of those those conversations that could really either help them or hurt them. That's why I applaud the program that you all have, because we don't have very many programs like that are really engaging people who are from the community and who are not homeowners, but who have potential to be homeowners. They're not necessarily being engaged in that particular way.
All right, I would like to say thank you, and I will conclude the comment section. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jasmine. So this has been an amazing and very insightful discussion. I'd like to once again thank Dean Massey, our panelists, and our student organizers. We will be taking a short 10-minute break before transitioning to our breakout room session for students to have the opportunity to have a more direct conversation with each of the panelists. This event is for all students who are interested, so if you did not sign up but you would still like to attend, please go ahead and join the Zoom meeting anyways. Thank you all once again.